Perhaps we can begin at the beginning, from when you were commissioned to engage in the or what was the process?
It's probably important to go back before the commission, I think, that our practice has always tried to be involved in first home buyers or second home buyers, because we feel that that our specialised skills, we may only do 10, 30 houses a year in terms of housing. And that's a very small leverage of what we actually believe in and what we do in terms of energy efficiency and all the other bits and pieces that go with it. So in the past we've worked with project home builders, and that's been a successful way for us of actually doing a design and that then gets levered out, and they might do 100, 200 or whatever it is. Plus, as well as influencing the way that that project home builder thinks and works, and it's an education process which has got a very big effect. And it's a very unglamorous side of the practice in the sense that it's depending on where the project home builder strikes his market, it depends on our involvement in the sense of design. One of the first ones we did was for Red Hill Homes, and they were really striking in the second and third home buyer, and we did a thing called the Pavilion back in the middle 80s, which was a really classic little solar house, nothing tricky, just designed in for the project home market, which is everything has to be very changeable and very manipulable. The only thing that we couldn't come to terms with, which is very, very hard to come to terms with, is orientation. And the only way to come to terms with orientation is basically to build an extremely well insulated box that is basically squarish with minimum glazing on. I mean, this is getting technical, but minimum glazing on all sides that can be worked out. This was the project home for Red Hill Homes, called the Pavilion. Was a classic solar home. It was divided like submarines into various thermal compartments, and you could change each of the thermal compartments, and it didn't really affect what happened to the rest of the building. And the way that we got over the changing sizes was to put a lot of thermal mass in. It's getting very technical very quickly, but anyway, that's to put a lot of thermal mass in, so no matter what they did, basically it was it could accommodate those things. Double glazing of thermal mass is the way to deal with those things. This one wasn't double glazed. So they were successful with another 2 for them. Then they disappeared out the door as a company. We did some work for Cosmopolitan Homes, some little weenie ones. Again, they were building a lot of stuff for the Department of Housing and Construction. So we got involved in design and construction.
So were they actually selling those as solar homes? I mean, was that a feature?
The Pavilion?
The Pavilion,
yeah.
I mean, both of those companies.
It was the first, I think it was the first home definitely in Victoria, and I think in Australia, to get a 5-star design rating. Either first home or first project home. It was very, very early, mid-80s. And they promoted it as a 5-star thing, and it won awards for energy efficiency. So they were promoting on that thing. They'd come from a background of nuts and berries, of doing log cabin style things, very timbery internal sort of stuff, which was fine as far as we were concerned. They had a construction system which was basically brick veneer with a timber ring beam and a vaulted ceiling system. And we just took their basic structure and amended it. So we then had Cosmopolitan Homes. And then about a bit over a year ago, the end of 93, end of 91, beginning of 92, we approached Hotondo and said to them, and the reason we approached them was that Hotondo, they are a project, first home builders. They build a huge number of houses. And they were the Department of Housing Construction or Planning or whatever it keeps changing its name. Biggest design and construct builder. And we rang the department and said, look, we want to get involved, we haven't had one for a while, we need to get back in that market for the moral reasons that we talked about, because it's not a money spinner at all. And we said, I mean, who would you recommend? And they said, well, there's Hotondo, they're the biggest, they're nice guys, and you know. So I approached them and said, would you like for us to design for you a range of energy efficient environmental housing? And they said, think about it, and they came back and said yes, which was terrific. And they're the most wonderful group of people. A father who started the company, and then a son and a brother in there. So it's normally when we work with family groups, we've found they are fantastic. The same with builders. If you have a father who's been the carpenter and the sons have followed on, or daughters, they're fantastic. So we approached Hotondo and we designed a range of houses called the Click and Fit range, which were basically we arranged the spaces, and they could design them how they liked, whether they were Federation or Victorian or modern or ranch or whatever. I wasn't interested in that, and that's what I was talking about, that where you slot your design in. So basically I arranged the spaces for them, and I said, look, here's a couple of forms you can use. But I don't want to get involved in any selection of materials, construction techniques, because once you start doing that at that end of the market, look at the planning and start building. They don't have to think, they know exactly what's going on. They go and cut the studs, all that sort of stuff. So in that one we had no influence at all on brick selection, anything except the basic floor layout, which is terrific, with some other options, because getting involved would have taken it out of that first home market, which is a very specialised market, as you know, because basically the punters ring up the phone and say, what's your range of houses, what are their areas, how much do they cost, and they write down the cost per square, because they're very, very, very price sensitive. So we did that work for Hotondo. The Green Home came up, and we heard about it rumbling around the various organisations it was rolling around. I think that was about early '92. We heard rumours from Alan Pearce, who works for Sustainable Solutions, and he was developing these things for ACF, Australian Conservation Foundation. And
Develop what things?
He was developing the Green Home Guidelines, which were a set of guidelines that would encapsulate good practice in building a green home. And it would not only deal with energy efficiency design, it would deal with materials and appliances and size. They were done in March '92, and in June '92 the ACF and Department of Housing and Construction got together and put out a design and construct tender, and that was the process that they got involved with. So we contacted Hotondo and they contacted us as one of those. We said, well, let's go for this. And we reckoned we had a good chance because we thought that we were one of the best designers of this sort of stuff, and they were one of the best builders, because it had to be built to the Department of Housing and Construction brief. You know, toilets have to be this size and bedrooms have to be this size. So it was really set at that design and construct market. So again, our philosophy of how far involved with the design we have to be involved. We're involved, we put up a proposal, but we didn't do any of the detailing, because again, we wanted to steer well clear of that to keep the price and the flavour of the house, because we designed for a flavour for a very different market. And it would have taken us months to get involved in the flavour of the other market, and they know it just like that. So that's how that amalgam, that's how we got involved. That's the answer to your question.
Okay, so go on.
No, I was going to say, just describe what came out of it. I mean, describe in your terms.
The building?
Yes, what's emerged from that process.
That process. What has emerged, this is a review rather than, is a building which satisfies the Green Home Guidelines. It's scored the greatest number of points yet for the HERS Home Energy Rating Scheme. So in terms of energy efficiency, it's excellent. It satisfies all the Department of Housing and Planning brief requirements in terms of area. It has missed the market slightly, because I think that there are very few two-storey homes, and because of the strange way the brief, not the strange way, the committee process of getting a brief together that would marry something which wasn't really market driven, it was driven by other externalities. It wasn't really market orientated for the people who they wanted to buy it. That's why at the moment it's not selling like hotcakes, but we can talk about that further. I think the important thing is, what's come out of it is that here is a physical example of what can be done with the Green Home Guidelines. And it's sort of hung halfway between a whole number of stools, which is interesting. And I think that that's an important part of the process, that if someone wanted to do it again, I think you need an icon, and then you need examples of how the icon can be fitted into various markets. And this was half an icon and half a market. And I think that's we're having a review meeting. I think that's one of the things that will come out of that review meeting, that we didn't clearly decide exactly where we wanted to go. But the funding of the building had to come from somewhere, and that's one of the reasons it went through that process.
The Green Home guidelines, I mean, as a designer, how did you feel about those guidelines?
Oh, they're really easy. I mean, for us as a designer, they just really encapsulated all of the stuff that we've been doing anyway. So it wasn't, there was no concern for us in dealing with them. The only concern, or the one concern we did have, which is still very unresolved, is material selection. And that's why we as a practice have gone off via Deakin to set up the Sustainable Materials Group to address that really obvious hole in this process. I mean, in terms of the thermal efficiency and the planning, all that stuff, I mean, it's all been known since the early 70s. I mean, it's all there. There's not a problem with that. The material selection is a problem. And also, which hasn't even been addressed anywhere, is really the process of building, as well as the materials that are brought onto site. How do we as a society want to build? I'm not necessarily talking about systems approaches versus you know, this other approach we use where we build on site. But how do we deal with power tools? How do we deal with waste? How do we deal with the whole approach of how we want to build and the resource management? So it's really materials and practices on site that is the whole that we need to deal with. So that's the one area that we had a problem with.
Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah.
Can you give us examples in relation to... I mean,
yes.
Remember that this is something that's in print. I'm asking that question, not can you,
but
no, are you happy about?
Yeah, no, that's fine. In terms of the materials and the ACF, the first thing you should say is the ACF should be wonderfully congratulated for putting together this whole concept, and it's very important to keep coming back to that reference point to understand the bits further on, and it is a long-term, it's a process that we're going through. And the first thing that they wanted to do was to they all agreed that it was a good thing to build a green home, and then the next step was to produce guidelines, which said, out of this very general principle, we'll produce some guidelines, and they are guidelines. And then beneath the guidelines become very specific things. And the detail of that specificness varies across the range of things that we're doing. So in terms of energy design, there's a very specific thing you could do. You could just drop it into a HERS rating and it would be, I mean, we're down to very fine details of how we calculate that stuff. In terms of appliance rating, because appliances are very much part of that, we have got a very detailed system set up by the government which rates appliances with stars, okay? The big hole we have is where materials come in, as I've said before. So, but the general philosophy is saying it's got to be green, here are some guidelines of how we interpret that. They're all fine, you know, like we should use plantation timbers or we should use recycled materials. We feel as though at the moment those philosophical directions are the correct ones to take. What we don't have at this stage is the practicalities of how you translate those guidelines into actual ordering techniques. So we had some things like concrete. Now we realised for thermal reasons we wanted concrete, that seemed good. What I tried to do is to get more fly ash to replace the cement in concrete with fly ash, which is, again, that really hasn't been, some people know about it, some people don't, but there's no ready thing where everyone's pushing the strength of concrete right to the end and trying to build, say, in summer where there's warmer weather, which means it sets quicker, because if you use a lot of fly ash in concrete in winter it doesn't set and there's a whole range of problems involved. So, I mean, all of that fine nitty-gritty detail wasn't there, so we just said, look, get as much fly ash in as you could. Now that's a long way in terms of the specificness of how we deal with that problem from the energy rating or the appliances. So that's one example. We used recycled steel for the reinforcing, because Smorgon's, and I think that Smorgon's, all of their steel comes from recycled sources. So that's heading in the right direction. In terms of their plastic film that they produce, that's all comes from recycled, or 70% comes from recycled sources. But again, the detail of whether it's 70% recycled or 100% recycled versus strength, we're not too sure on. In terms of the timber frame, we wanted to use plantation timbers, which is radiata pine. As an aside, which comes from a Steiner background that I've studied to develop, I have concerns about anything which comes from a mono plantation. Anything mono seems to me, and I can't quantify, I have no evidence, but anything mono seems wrong, and I don't know how to deal with that yet. And maybe we should be taking timber out of forests, but logging specifically. And again, these are just totally uninformed comments, but we went the path of using plantation pine, because at the moment that seems to be the best thing that we should be doing. In terms of using bricks, we looked at traditional clay bricks and recycled bricks and Hebel. And it was, again, there was this, we didn't have an evaluation system of how we could stack all of those things together. In terms of marketability, I mean, it had to look sort of normal.
That was part of the brief? That was a requirement in the brief, that it should look normal?
No, that was something that I brought to the project because I felt very strongly that it, I wanted to step away from making it a social design decision. I wanted to really try and let Hotondo drive as much as the marketing and what they felt was acceptable to the marketplace as possible.
So in some senses it is in the brief then. What you're saying is that Hotondo
no, it's not,
made
that's
a decision.
That's not in the brief. I brought that to the agenda.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
No, yes, okay.
Yeah. Rightly or wrongly, I'm not sure whether that was a right or a wrong decision.
We can come back and talk about it.
Yeah. So the bricks was interesting. I mean, so I opted for saying, well, the market thing is so strong for bricks externally that look like new bricks. We've got to go that way. And I couldn't evaluate that against the recycled bricks or Hebel. The Hebel were more expensive, but they had a better insulation value, and you had to render it. Now, maybe there was an advantage in rendering a building, but my gut feeling said that there are no rendered buildings in any of those estates around there. They're not going to go for the first or second home buyer. Further up the market, totally different.
There was a requirement in the Green Homes Guide that you considered embodied energy in those materials or not?
I think not. No, I mean, right, no.
There wasn't.
The answer is there was no process to evaluate it. Looking for the Green Home Guidelines. You can have a copy of this. The siting, floor plan, construction, steel framing should not be used. Oh, I mean, here's the materials, okay? No rainforest or non-plantation timber. It's got to be insulated. Steel framing can't be used. Floor's got to be concrete slab on ground. Window frames have to be timber, and you've got to draft proof. They're the mandatory requirements. And the desirable features say timber aerated concrete block or lightweight brick cladding are preferred to standard bricks because of their lower greenhouse impacts, because of lower transport costs. Basically, the heavier the material it is to cart the cost to site. That's the theory of the thinking. Now again, I don't know whether that's correct or not. I mean, a truck will take a load of bricks. I don't know.
And you need to balance the energy that went into the creation of the brick in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have any idea why the energy content of the materials wasn't included? I mean, given that now you're looking at the issue of materials.
Yeah, I think that we don't, well, definitely we don't know in Australia. I mean, the work being done in Australia at the moment is looking and comparing the stuff that's been done in the States and overseas, and it's different. And it's obviously very, very local, the way that you make things. I mean, so if you make something in Tasmania using electricity from hydropower, it has a totally different effect to making something in Victoria and in New South Wales and Queensland. And we don't know those answers. So this was, you'd have to confirm this with Alan Pearce, but this is all defendable to a large extent. And it's doable now, and it's a now thing. And that was terrific. I mean, I think it was an excellent idea. Let's do something which isn't off the tree. Let's do something which we think is good, solid practice, and see if we encourage people to do good, solid practice in construction.
In terms of the materials and the construction of it, the materials that were selected, was that in I mean, was that you selecting those materials, or
we all did. We all had a finger in the pie. I mean, one of the interesting ones, we used treated pine for all of the external timber, and the stuff that comes out of the States says, well, it's sort of okay. I mean, what are the alternatives? I mean, what are the options you're using? Are you using a rainforest timber, or are you using an untreated pine, which isn't suitable, or an untreated softwood, which is probably not suitable? So we debated that one around. There was myself, the builder.
That's because Australian hardwood was excluded.
Well, at that stage, I mean, to use untreated Australian, I mean, I didn't want to treat it. I didn't want to paint it, I suppose. We were looking at trying to let something just hang there. Yeah, I mean, yes. The answer was I didn't want to use Australian hardwood because we've been through the Porter Group and looked at, and that's the group that we use in terms of timber, because I think that they give a sensible approach to it all. Their understanding is that there is timber coming out of the Upper and Bright hardwoods that are being grown on a sustainable process. Now, again, I don't know how to evaluate that, but I mean, so we could have used some hardwoods, but I didn't think that hardwoods were appropriate for that house without treating them.
So in terms of, I think the materials selection, given that there is quite a bit of flexibility within the guidelines, is a good example perhaps of talking about the issue of collaboration and coming to decisions, because this is a project where a collaboration between you and the builder and ACF.
Absolutely.
So when sitting around trying to decide, what are your perceptions of that process?
Where we had knowledge and skill, it was good, because we could refer to the knowledge and skill and arrive at a sensible decision. Where we didn't have knowledge and even less skill, it was extremely difficult and frustrating, and it was a real thorn in the side of the, no, let's delete that. It was, it made the building process somewhat difficult, because that the ACF were set up as the body who would approve or not approve certain materials. That was the structure of the process. And that I would say, why don't we use this? And the builder, I was contracted to the builder, and the builder was contracted to the department. And the department deferred to the ACF for the materials. So in terms of a process, it was tricky. And I think that one of the things that would have been beneficial would have been if there'd been another 20 grand or 30 grand somehow put into the project, where we could have all been employed on a much bigger basis. We didn't know this problem existed, I don't think, when we started. Where we could have all sat down and we could have had a research assistant go off and say, look, let's go and see what the best advice is on timbers, or let's go, I mean, and get a quick best-off answer.
Whereas the assumption is ACF was doing it.
The assumption was that ACF, and they had one person who was working on a whole range of projects, and this was one of his projects. So he was totally overloaded and couldn't respond in time, not because of a lack of desire or wanting to do it. It was just that he was overloaded, and that was a glitch in the process. That if we did it again, and we need to review it in this review process, this exit meeting we're going to have, that I think that we would do again. But you only find these things by actually going through the process and finding what's there. Yeah. So it could have been, that's one area that could have been done a lot better, but I think what it does highlight that we did all the easy stuff easily, and we did the hard stuff slowly and badly, which makes sense, I mean, in review.
And before we lose the point, you were saying that, I mean, the focus is on some areas and not on others, and you raised the issue about on-site work. I mean, what's your observation about the amount of the environmental efficiency of
on-site practice.
Of the on-site practice in this case?
I think that there's a lot of waste, and I think that we could, I mean, in any construction building site process there's a lot of waste, and I think it would be extremely simple to just have a process of having bins there, or I don't know exactly what the process is, but of having bins there that when you drop a toilet on the site and a work shed, you drop on the bins, the recycling bins, and you just put the waste in there. So one, it keeps the site clean. Two, that you understand that anything that isn't used on this project can be used in another project. That's dealing with waste. I think that there could be coming an increasing argument in having stuff much more closely manufactured off-site. Like there could well be an advantage for wall frames and trusses, and builders have a lot of difficulties. No, that's a false statement. There's a lot of debate in the building industry about the advantage of trusses, because sometimes they come, I mean, you make a measurement, it's wrong, and you've got to go and amend it. You know, it's just the sheer humanity of building with a system, with a prefab system on a site, and all of those problems associated. So for these guys, Hotondo have got these fabulous chippies that just, the frame was up in a couple of days. It was just, you know, it's just up. And part of that process is they know the way that they're made. And is that better than building stuff on site? I don't know. But the on-site practices, I think that we, as well, apart from the waste, is how do we deal with things like properly installing insulation? There still hasn't been an understanding or some sort of trait. Like, installing insulation is very, very important. I mean, if you look at all of the energy figures out of buildings, if the insulated envelope is right, the other things take on far less significance. And there's a whole lot of caveats that one could obviously attach to that, but it's so important. And the trade still hasn't picked up how to install insulation, to understand thermal bridges and all of that sort of stuff. It is just something you do. You know, it's a subsidiary thing. But from the thermal point of view, it's absolutely vital. And there's no conceptual understanding. Like the carpenters have a conceptual understanding of structure. They understand you need lintels and ties and that sort of stuff. That's part of the training. The insulation training isn't in the understanding, and I think that's come from, I mean, it's relatively new, it's only 20 years old in terms of, you know, the training of history of people coming through. Things like understanding how you actually install insulated copper pipes. I mean, the green stuff that goes on. I mean, we should abandon that and really start insulating our pipes with 25mm. Let's get serious about this. Yeah, let's get serious. Let's understand about doing the corners. Let's understand about where we put this sort of, and that should be all part of the basic trade stuff. And I quite often take the view that you can't specify anything on a site. Basically, the guys are going to do it or they're not going to do it, and that really comes back to the detailing, because in the detailing, we've just done a review for Brunswick Council of 9 buildings that went through their planning code, which is an energy efficient planning code. And basically we found that when we put them through a HERS scheme, an assessment, a lot of the concept was good, but the detailing hadn't been carried out, and therefore negating the conceptual or the aim of what was being done. When you get down to this sort of stuff, the detailing is so important. Draft proofing, getting the insulation right, getting the insulation on not only the building fabric but the pipes and all that sort of stuff. It's really, really important, because we're starting to screw the thing down and down and down. I mean, it's that Japanese approach of iteration. You take a product, you do it better, you do it better, you do it better, you do it better, and the improvement is there.
Do you think that changed your role? I mean, were you, with the Green Home, more concerned about detail and perhaps spend more time? No?
In retrospect, I would do it differently. My role was basically to hand over a basic design and to act as an advisor when they ask questions.
Okay, if you were to do it again, I mean, if the whole thing was now a new version of this was possible, we're not doing it over, but we're doing something in the same area again, with some of the associated partners and the constraints and so on able to be changed, what would you change and what would you do? Or where should we go from here?
Yeah, I would.
I'm watching.
Yeah, the building process of these buildings is very quick. It's the first thing you must understand. Very different from an architect designed house, where it goes a lot slower. These ones, the frame is up in a couple of days. The brickies are on site. The plumbing, everything is done at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Any supervision can't be done but in a traditional architect builder role. It's not possible unless you live on the site and check all of the detailing. So in terms of I'll get to you, but in terms of a traditional supervision of how you want to do it, that won't work. What you have to do is you have to change the building practice of the supervisor and the tradesmen who are on the site. So if I was doing this green home again, and I don't know how this applies to building lots of these things, but for this example, I would become much more closely involved in the detailing of how we're going to do it. I would then have a day-long meeting with all of the tradesmen, and that would need money. You'd have to pay them to come there. I mean, they make money by attending. To come along and say, look, let's go through all of the stuff that's going to be involved. I'll teach you all about insulation, and you tell me if there's any problem that you've got in dealing with that. Let's understand the role of insulation, of sealing gaps. Let's go to all of the plumbers and the electricians and everyone else like that, and to actually say these are the significant things thermally, as well as all of your other concerns. It's got to be safe electrically, all that sort of stuff. For this building, this is really important, so that they, as they're doing the process, they understand what they should be looking for and improving. So that you build up a team for a site. And that leads, yes, that's for that building. In my architectural practice, I only deal with one builder now, and I therefore deal with only generally one group of subbies. And the builder is philosophically exactly in the same place as I am. And we have a traditional architect builder role, and he has a traditional builder subbie role. But what we're doing is that I'm trying to create this team that is contractually still separate, but there's an education process going on all the time where we achieve a much, much better result. So for a builder, say like Hotondo, maybe they have to educate and have in-house training for this specific thing. In terms of construction, that's what I think I'd try and do. I mean, the ideal situation would just to go and live out on site for the 3 months that they did it, which is, not sensible. Not sensible, but not acceptable. I can't run a practice like that. And no one could afford to pay the, whatever it is, 30 or 40 grand to sit out there.
Interesting your answer to that question, because it wasn't quite where I thought you'd go. But, is it only the nature of the construction process, the building process, that you would change in revisiting, or to do something new from this, or? Oh, right. Sorry, I was concentrating.
What the whole concept of the green home?
Yeah. What would you like to be involved in next by way of a green home?
Yep. The role of this house was to be an icon. No one ever stated that, but that's what it was. To be an example of how it could be done, as in practical terms, how you could interpret the Green Home Guidelines. As I said before, the confusion was that it also had to be a marketable icon.
So it had to look the same as everything else. It had to be an icon.
Yes, yeah, and in retrospect, I don't think I understood that clearly understood at the beginning of that process that was going on. So at the beginning of the process, I would make very clear, are we building an icon, and all of the things that implies, or are we building something which is saleable and marketable and pretty good? And I think I opted for the first one. I know I did, because I stood back from the process and said, look, here's all the good bits that I've been contracted to do. You go and do it like a marketable house, okay? For me, the only unusual feature of the house would be, say, the pergola on the front, which was designed to, hopefully, to be seen as something you could rip off and put on a more traditional pergola. That was the only really design thing that I pushed beyond what would normally be marketable acceptance, I would think. I would now shoot for the icon and then I would have the icon there, and inside the building, when people went to see it, how you could interpret the icon in drawings or graphics or floor plans, the first home buy, the Federation style, whatever you decided fitted the market or the executive home, but interpreting it, but to set up an icon in our place that people could visit and understand the principles of what was going on. I think this is a confusing object.
And I'm confused. I mean,
between icon and market?
Yes. I mean, or between your view of the interplay between those things. I mean,
yep.
That one could clearly what the aim of this house is that, by and large, except as you said for the pergola, you drive past it and you wouldn't know it was Green Home.
Exactly.
Okay. So in terms of the market, it's not actually being marketed as a green. Do you think? I'm trying not to ask you the questions rather.
Yeah, no.
But I mean,
yeah, I understand.
What's your view about the degree to which a green object should look distinguishable from a non-green object?
Right, yes.
How does that relate to the market?
Yeah,
there are other ways of looking at the market.
Yeah, yep.
Do people who buy a house want to look the same as...
Yep. Right. My view is a green home shouldn't look any different from the rest of the market. It's the same way as an energy efficient building shouldn't look any different. It shouldn't look necessarily energy efficient, or it shouldn't look necessarily green. I see the greenness and the energy efficiency is just another aspect that one brings into a high quality product. I mean, it just addresses, it's part of the issues that are addressed and competently solved. My dilemma with this building is that the exposure that it'll get, it had to have something different. It had to be something that could look different and stand out in the magazines as saying, you know, notice me, I'm, you know, come to me and I'll explain what I'm saying, an icon. But it also had to fulfil the Department of Housing and Construction's thing of saying, well, it's got to fulfil the brief and it's got to be saleable to, it's got to fit into the D&C brief, it's got to do all of those sorts of things, which is very, very different. And as I said before, I didn't understand those two things clearly at the beginning of the process, and I tended towards the first one. What I would like to revisit that question, what I would like to do, I would have liked to have had a free rein of saying, as with all the other D&C people, saying, look, I'd like to design something which I reckon is really says green, right at the far end of green. Buildable now, but the far end of green. The market that I would choose would be my age group, people who are looking for that, to make the green move from their existing home. You know, this is their second or third home, you know, their incomes are 50 to above, you know, that two people, I mean, solid, middle, no, that's not an awful word to say. But, you know, relatively well-off people who want to do it, okay? Not this sort of thing. And that would be much more visible in the marketplace, because it would be a high quality product that hits a high quality market. And that as you then take the principles of that icon and you can apply it to a whole range of things, as well as being applied to that particular building.
Would you say that the assumption that something different, a green aesthetic that is different to this, did you explore that assumption that green aesthetic can't be achieved within a particular market?
Yeah.
I'd say first home buyers market in terms of money, in terms of cost, that something different couldn't be achieved. Did you explore? Yes,
well, I mean, yes, and I think that the green home guidelines do explore that, and it's obviously it's very achievable. To satisfy the green home guidelines compared to, it's exemplified in the click and fit range that we organised for Tondo. To go from their energy efficient click and fit range, which didn't cost them anything extra, basically the building's insulated, the rooms face north, they're on a concrete slab, the windows are shaded, the right size and shaded. I mean, really ordinary basic stuff. To go from there to a green home, you have to install energy efficient appliances, you have to put on some extra door seals, and you have to put on a solar hot water system, basically. That's simple. Now that would cost you maybe an extra, for the solar hot water system, say 2.5, 3, say 4, an extra 4, to go from a house that can be sold in the marketplace, to compete with everyone else, to a green object. And the only discernible difference would be a solar hot water heater on the roof. Now first home buyers really aren't, $5 grand is a lot for a huge amount. I mean, it might be for a house and land package you can get for 80 grand. 5 grand is, you're not going to spend it on a solar hot water heater, you're going to spend it on an ensuite or an extra bedroom. You're not going to spend it on those things. So that's where that that's where that confusion really lies. And as I've reviewed the process, it's become clearer that those two things were confused. I mean, we're all struggling through it. I'm cool about that.
Have there been many criticisms of the home, given that the launch is kind of was
I haven't had any personally I haven't had any feedback yet. We're going to find that from this exit meeting we're having to see what the market, how it's going. And I hear it's not going very well. What?
When is that?
Very soon.
I wonder whether it's a good idea for us to actually do a small addendum to talk to you after.
Yeah, sure. 7th of May.
Oh yeah, no, could be quite interesting.
Oh well, no, I think it's good.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's very useful to talk to you now. Yeah.
I mean, there's just letting this interview structure deteriorate even more from it. I'm sorry.
It's fine. No.
But I mean, there's an argument that is clearly articulated within the area of manufactured products, which is that if you are changing a manufactured product to improve its green qualities, then it should be discernibly, in some form, aesthetic, something visibly different.
That's could I say that's only for me from a marketing point of view, and not from a client point of view.
No, sorry, it's totally from a marketing point of view. It's to differentiate
the
product in the market.
Absolutely.
Now, what's your feeling then about how that approach that operates in the manufactured products area, production consumption in that area, how does that relate to the issue about marketing a green home?
I think there's a social justice issue involved in here. That greenness and all it has benefits both to society and to the individual, and that there comes a point where that recognition has to be very clearly understood. That in terms of the additional costs of, say, to go from the traditional project first home buyer to the green home, we have, as a society, we've made the social justice decision that we want to have insulation, which is individuals are paying for the benefit for society, which then flows back to themselves, and the argument of power station, we all know that argument. The same argument can apply to solar hot water heaters, but it's such a big lump, sort of 2.5 grand to say 1,000. I mean, relatively at this end of the market, there's an argument. We talked about identifiable, so I'm getting confused here.
So are you saying that the only identifiable features, the identical change in aesthetic, or the visible change for greenness in this case, is having a solar heater on the roof? Well, that's sufficient to distinguish.
No, that's not. Oh, in terms of the market. No, I'll go back to.
Sorry,
I'm getting confused. confused.
Let me just revisit that.
Yeah.
The directions in manufactured products are, yes, we can change and improve the environmental quality of them.
Yep.
We can do so within a price range where they're still competitive, but we need to change the aesthetic so they are discernibly not the other.
Yeah.
Now, what about this? Where the aesthetic
is right. I think the social justice argument said to me is that basically I think that the greenness should be available to the first home to everyone.
Yes.
And that if you want to take on the symbolism of greenness, you can, and that would be an architect could design I mean, that's what that pergola is talking about in a way, and the solar hot water is a mechanical process of design. But I think that we should be, as a society, we should be saying we think greenness doesn't have to. It's so important we shouldn't have to market it. It should be available, and so that we. Somehow or other we work out a way of getting everyone to build green at that end of the market. Now, if you want to make a decision later on in your second and third home that you want to express that greenness as part of the design process and market it, so for resale and all those sort of things, I think that's a separate issue. But I think that there's the social justice issue of getting right at that very bottom line, and that's why I think that this one was very interesting, and it's clouded by this issue of icon and market.
Okay, so if we were like 10, 20 years in the future where the solar hot water and those type of quite expensive environmental add-ons, for want of a better term, were cheap or were relatively cheap, and it wasn't that extra $5,000-6,000 that needed to be got from somewhere. Would you approach this differently in terms of aesthetic?
Yeah, because the green issue wasn't there. I mean, if it was an acceptable green, I mean, it's very interesting in Europe, what's happening in Europe at the moment. I mean, when people start to talk about green and eco, I mean, people are starting to smell rats, and I think there's a real flavour that's coming out of, from my reading of Europe at the moment, that this bandwagon is dying. You know, this sense of you know, you have to be very, very careful of how you market it. And I think that's the beginning of that process that you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, the whole raison d'etre of doing that building would disappear. So I would just design an energy efficient building that did all of these things. It would be the design of that building for me also, there's a whole lot of spirituality, and which is another range, another area of where I'm into. And that's, if you want to explore that issue, I mean, I would have explored that issue much more overtly, I suppose, than what was done in there.
I mean, just perhaps not kind of continuing on the marketing too much, but it's interesting that the market is centred on first home buyers.
For this project.
For this project.
Yeah.
Was there any exploration of environmental perceptions of that particular group?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Because it doesn't seem to have been concentrated on a potential green market, even within that.
It doesn't seem to have been market driven.
No, it's been driven by the ACF's desire to come to terms with how they can tangibly advance market analysis. May have been done, not ad hoc, what's the word, de facto, by the fact that they went to the Department of Housing and Construction, which has got an inbuilt thing.
But it's conceivably possible that you would find, I mean, I'm not suggesting it is, but it's conceivably possible you'd find that first home buyers now are quite concerned about environment, would like to know that what they're buying is an environmentally sound home, and would also like their character and their interest in that in some way reflected by something that actually breaks from the traditional aesthetic.
Yes.
it shouldn't go anywhere without some market analysis.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You mentioned at the beginning that it's not selling.
That's my understanding. I don't know the figures. This is only 5 minutes conversation.
We'll come back to that after that.
Yeah, I think so.
I think we should certainly do that.
When I've got some facts to talk about.
Given that we will have a chance to do more of that, then can we, perhaps it'd be worth jumping to a bit of sort of going through your background and you know how this fits into your overall practice. I mean, how are you as an architect, David Oppenheim, architect, working around the margins of being interested in environment?
Do you want a history?
I want some kind of version that would explain to people how you got to be concerned about these areas and what has changed you as in terms of your practice overall, not just this project.
I've always been interested in art and science. I've always been fascinated by the interface between the left and the right side of the brain, of how you reconcile those two things. And I've always had, apart from the interface, I've had an interest in science and an interest in arts and the beyond and the cosmic. And when we did architecture, when I did architecture in the late 60s, early 70s, it was very, some of it was science driven, and the design was extremely fashion driven, or with very little theory. In 1973, with the first oil crisis, I was working in Melbourne, and that seemed to me a way forward for me to try and resolve the science and the social responsibility of being an architect, instead of designing fashion, but actually designing something which had some meaningful contribution to the built environment, meaningful for me. And that basically at that stage was expressed in terms of a solar efficient design, just looking at designing solar buildings, and that went on, I suppose, for 10 years, and that took on, I learned about it until 1980, I suppose, and then came back and started David Oppenheim Architects with Michael Taylor in 1980. And it was, what I'd learned overseas is that you can't run a solar practice. You have to run a traditional practice that has as a sub-issue, which can either be overt or covert, solar energy. And so any of the projects that we got that came into the office, we would make them solar efficient. If people wanted to know about it, we would explain all of that. If people didn't want to know about it, well, we just let it lie, but we did it. So it was a real subset of the general design. I was still extremely unhappy, I suppose, about the way that we designed. We were still struggling for finding expressible form, and I really didn't want to design buildings that were solar diagram extrusions, which was a common thing to do at that stage. We moved from residential to non-residential, so it was still very much solar-driven or energy, and it moved from solar-driven to energy-efficient driven. We started to expand out of the building fabric into both residential and non-residential, looking at appliances and the energy efficiency of the whole of the object. And then in 87, I went to Coffs Harbour, and the kids went to a Steiner school, and all of a sudden this whole world of Steiner education, which got also expanded into a cosmic understanding, which is a difficult word, of how we all fit into the cosmic world, I suppose. And that's when I came to see that the solar and the energy was really just a subset of trying to live in harmony with nature. I've never really been a nuts and berries boy, I suppose, in terms of the way that I run my life, of actually digging the soil and doing mud brick houses and that sort of thing. It's never really appealed to the way that I work. But he was an intellectual framework that really gave me some basis to go forward. So that for me the interest now is much more how do these buildings connect into the cosmic framework, and for me that building is much more interesting in terms of sacred geometry and a whole all of those other subjects that surround sacred geometry than the energy efficiency. That's just like a little subset that I do, and that's okay, and that's all part of it. So this building I suppose fits in for me as being an interesting building that deals with this particular issue at the moment, but it also fits into this much bigger framework of cosmic architecture, I suppose. And that's, for me, that's the thing that's driving my practice at the moment, or my part of the practice of yeah.
And what sort of perspective does that give you on the rest of the profession? You don't have to answer.
No, of course. No. I mean, I find it interesting. No, I acknowledge that we all have different interests and different ways that we want to proceed down. I've always found it fascinating that people have denied, lots of people, most people, have denied the knowledge and skill that's available in designing energy efficient buildings. I've always thought that as being a disappointment that they couldn't add that skill to their whatever other repertoire that they want to build. It's the drives that informs their practice. I've always, and now that I've expanded that interest into a much more holistic approach, I find it interesting that when I talk and lecture about that approach, that there is this huge groundswell of people that say, thank God someone is actually practicing and is enunciating a totally different way of designing rather than a fashion or a theory-driven practice which seems very isolated from the way that we as human beings live our lives.
So you're saying everybody, when you lecture, that's students we're talking about?
Oh no, I do a lot of public lecturing too.
Mm-hmm. But I mean architectural students?
Yeah,
right?
yes, oh yes. Students seem to be given two ways that they can take a theory-driven way of designing, where it's based on a theory or historical, or an RMIT approach, I would call it. For what, I mean, I'm not trying to box RMIT into a box, but that my understanding of that it seems to be that way driven. Compared to, say, there's another way of taking it, which is a much more technological driven way. Now, how you want to deal with that technology is a different thing, or can be through the construction process or through the thermal process, or they seem to be the two sub-schools of that technological grade. And they seem to be two things which aren't interconnected. You can either have one or the other. And that, to me, exemplifies the left and right side of the brain. It's very obvious that why there are those two discernible interests and why it's extremely hard to find people who are interested in both, because generally architects are much more dominant in one side of the brain or the other. No, I accept that. What I try and teach is a holistic approach which accepts that we do have left and right side of the brain, that we do need to address all of the issues, and that we should come to some understanding that they're not separate issues, but they're just parts of the whole. And that seems to be a third approach.
How do you think architects are coping?
It's 1 o'clock.
Okay. How do you think architects or the community of architects are coping and dealing with environmental issues, given what you've just said?
It's a non-issue.
Mm-hmm.
Within Australia? Internationally?
No, I'd only say within Australia, because they're the architects that I know. Internationally, I don't have any evidence one way or the other. I think that it's interesting that in New Zealand and America, their annual conferences both this year are based on sustainability. That's the driving thing of the conference. And I don't know what the Institute of Architects' annual theme for their conference is. Challenge of excellence or something like that. And I find that, again, I suppose I accept that we all have the right to be different, and I think that I'm extremely reticent to be a zealot because I don't think people listen to zealots. Not really. I mean, you can cause a lot of waves and you can cause a lot of press and stuff like that. But in the end, people don't listen to zealots. People actually listen to action and to sound reasoned argument, I think, and not to zealots. So I think things that are happening in the States, and I'm sure it's happening in Europe, but I don't know the details of the Europeans, various design groups. I think it would be very interesting. It would be a very interesting survey just to find out what each Institute of Architects annual conference is doing, and you would find where they are at.
Well, because the Chicago one this year is the International Union as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to go, but I can't afford it.
Yeah, that's right.
You go?
No, Richard Fuchs is going.
Given the amount of buildings in Melbourne, perhaps actually designed by architects,
which is very small.
Do you think that one designer has the ability to create change?
Yeah, I mean, that's exemplified. I mean, Glenn Murcutt has changed the whole way that we look at roofs. I'm trying to think of some other. Harry Zeidler's totally changed the way that we looked at entrance foyers. Rightly or wrong. I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying that I think one designer can have a huge influence, but only on the architectural community. I mean, it's this trickle-down effect.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a liberal, but there is...
It's an osmosis effect.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally change in Australian architecture has occurred in, Boyd pointed this out, in upper-class homes, middle-class homes, general housing moves across to non-residential. There's the flow that goes on. And I think that's just the way that the people in the upper-class homes, they can afford to be different and also want to be different and talk about expressing their differences and their nowness. So I think it is possible. This is a big structural change, though. This is a huge structural change that we're talking about. We're not just talking about a fashion. I mean, it's interesting to follow. We're on Sweet Sweet, and the way that we wash ourselves. It's fascinating to follow that process of how we wash ourselves and how we do it non-residentially.
Perhaps just to finish, in 20, 30 years' time, when you're tripping off around doing your
Australia loop.
How would you like to
Or a
think?
beach bum on them.
Yeah.
How would you like to think that people remember or consider David Oppenheim? What impact would you like to have?
I would love to be remembered as a person of integrity who cared about a holistic approach that took all the issues and balanced them and arrived at a reasonable solution. That sounds really Mother Earth statement, doesn't it? But that's, that really cared about the way that we sit on the earth.
Good. Do you have anything further?
No, I think we should stop it there and allow it some time to